Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Bethany Jantzi. We're going to be talking about cults and how you might actually surprisingly be in one or in a cult environment, or why they are terrible and how they can be harmful for people, and what to do if you're in one, what to do if you know someone who's in one. All that today. Very important information. You might not be in one specifically, but you might know someone who is, and that could be very harmful if you don't really know what to do in that situation. So, how are you doing today, Bethany?
I'm good. I'm excited. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, of course, you have a background in this topic. Could you just real quickly just tell us your background and understanding cult dynamics and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So, I have a Master of Science in the Psychology of Coercive Control from the only program in the world that studies this nuanced topic. So, in this master's, we studied cults, we studied high control groups, we studied really coercive control is really the foundation for any kind of ongoing abuse. So we studied radicalization and extremism. We studied cult recruitment. So we looked at all of these things. And yeah, this has always been a really big passion of mine. And as someone who grew up in the church and has sometimes seen how churches and faith environments can tilt more towards high control, it's always been a topic that's really fascinated me. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so that people are, I'm sure people are wanting to know, what is
Mhm.
the official definition of a cult?
There is none. Well, it really depends who you ask.
Hmm.
There's lots of different theorists that will put forward their kind of framework and idea for what a cult is.
Okay.
Um, but really, I don't like to oversimplify it because
Okay.
cults and high control groups really exist on a spectrum. So if I kind of bring it down to 3 points, then if someone is in a destructive high control group, but they don't meet one of the points, they're going to automatically be like, oh, well, that's not me. That's why I like to keep it more about talking about a high control group, a high demand group, because those words, when I use them to describe cults, they tell you right away what is the kind of characteristics
Hmm.
that make up and kind of in broad strokes describe these groups is that they are high demand. So one of the trademarks we see of cults is that there is an escalating commitment once you get into the group. So I like to call it like a high demand group. And the way that we see cults affect people is that at a certain point in these groups, um, what is required for your continued membership is something that actually is incredibly harmful to yourself. So inevitably you will have to sacrifice parts of yourself, whether
Hmm.
that is your critical thinking, whether that means cutting off all of your family members, whether that means giving over all of your money to this group. So every high control group at a certain point, you will have to sacrifice your own well-being onto the platform of this group's reputation and the image that they're trying to maintain. And then the other word I like to use is high control. So, a high control group, again, talking about how these groups really extend an enormous amount of control over their members. And we're talking about control that even extends to like the way that people are able to think about the group that they're in and its
Hmm.
ideology, or the way that members visualize the group leader. So there's a psychological control that is present in these groups. So yeah, I like to talk about a high demand group or a high control group. But yeah, we can talk more too about all the different things that make these groups what they are. But that's kind of a brief overview. But
Okay. All right.
yeah.
So that I mean, people might think like, okay, that's pretty vague.
Mm-hmm.
So um, uh, for before we get into that, I just want to talk about the definition there. So
Mm-hmm.
you did talk about like how there are disagreements among theorists of like what makes
Yeah.
a cult. So is there any like specific thing that is agreed upon, or is it just all over the place, or um, how should people think about that at least?
Yeah. So you could, in one sentence, you could say that it is a group of people that are devoted to a person or an ideology to a point that it overtakes their life and it undercuts their critical thinking skills.
Hmm.
So, yeah, this can be groups that this can happen in workplaces where workplaces operate as mini cults, abusive and violent relationships, intimate relationships are literally like a cult of one, where there's like, you are the only follower and that person is your ideology and your group leader all wrapped up in one. And they can form around anything. They can form around products. We see like commercial cults, we see self-improvement cults, we see religious cults, obviously we see therapy cults, counseling cults. So yeah, we can really see cults and these kinds of groups develop around anything or any person. So yeah.
Interesting. Very
Yeah.
fascinating. Okay. So here's the next one. So do cult leaders always do it for money?
So I think that is, I would say no. Of course, there are going to be some people that will realize very quickly how they can monetize their charisma or their skills that they have of persuasion, their speaking ability. So there are going to be those people for sure, but then not every person that makes money off of their expertise or their ideology is a cult leader. But I would say that a lot of cult leaders, so like the stereotypical cult leader is like a charismatic leader, and it's someone who claims to have some kind of special knowledge or special revelation or like insight into something that normal people don't have access to. So cults and ideologies are selling you something, they're pitching you on something. And when you have a centralized cult around one person, that person will claim to possess some kind of special revelatory insight or like a gifting to see to another portal, or like will claim that they can heal you from your past trauma, or that they can solve the world's problems. So you're looking at a leader that claims to have some kind of extraordinary or special gifting, ability, or knowledge.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something interesting you said there because yeah, most people the stereotype is like that you got a cult leader and you got some followers and
Mm-hmm.
maybe sometimes it's religious, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious why that like isn't a mandatory because that's like what most people think is a cult. So like in
Yeah.
when I say mandatory, I mean like in your definition of what a cult is. So
Yeah.
so you're saying that a cult can be someone that doesn't have like a main leader.
Yeah, so this is what, so the other thing too is that this kind of pinnacle of like the charismatic cult leader is that we've seen cult leaders who are actually like very sort of bumbling, and they seem not very socially smooth, they're not charming, they're not charismatics. We have like people like Keith Raniere from Nexium who like just his physical appearance and like the way that he presents himself, he seems a bit socially awkward. And he doesn't have this like intense eye contact that seduces you and that draws you in. Like, but what he does, so the people that don't have this charisma, what they have is an incredible capacity for persuasion and for influence. So like Keith Raniere is an incredible speaker. So like someone who's dynamic, who is really articulate and compelling, that will also draw people in. But yeah, we've seen cult leaders that are actually not great at expressing themselves or just seem socially awkward. So that's why I don't like to say it's the charismatic cult leader, because then if you're a part of a group and your leader is awkward and self-effacing, you'll be like, oh, it doesn't meet that category. But the other way that I see it is for cults or high control groups that are more decentralized. So it's around more an ideology or a belief system than a person. You won't necessarily have a clear, obvious, charismatic leader. So one example of this is even like if you think about Amish groups, they don't have a charismatic leader, but their system, the rules, the rituals, the legalism, the social isolation, in many ways that will function as a high control group, but it technically in most circles doesn't meet the definition of having a charismatic cult leader. It doesn't mean that there might be a more local person in like a specific community that functions in that role, but I just don't want people to think there's no charismatic leader, so it's not a cult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you
Right.
can have like an ideology-based high control environment, or you can have more of like a cult of personality where we do see more of like the charismatic or compelling cult leader as like an individual or a family as well.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
And so and all cults aren't religious, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. They can form around anything and everything. Um, yeah, like self-improvement cults have been
Mm,
such a big thing for a really long time. Even like we've seen psychotherapy cults, which is really scary, where there's like someone who's claiming to help you see and uncover your true traumas and get to the root
mm.
issues you can have healing. But then it ends up being a high control group that exerts extreme control over the people within it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So, yeah.
I can think of like pyramid schemes, stuff like that. That's kind of like an interesting environment. Do you think that fits
Yeah,
in there somewhere?
absolutely. So we would call those commercial cults.
Okay.
So, yeah, and like, but they still have a promise or some kind of claim that they're offering that is bringing people in. So, for pyramid schemes, it's this idea that you can be your own boss, you can be the person who has true time freedom, you can own your time.
Mm,
Like, that is within your reach if you follow our program, if you sell our patented and special products.
mm,
That can be a vehicle to give you the life that you've always wanted, to give you that financial freedom. So that's their pitch that they're selling.
mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And someone mentioned it in the chat. So I was, could you talk about the potential of a church being a cult? So just
Mhm.
like your typical Baptist church or something like that.
Yeah.
What would need to happen in that type of church environment to be considered a cult in your eyes?
Yeah. So, one thing that happens a lot in any high control group or ideology is that it's authoritarian in structure. So, by its very nature, we see a lot of hierarchy, and we see that the authority and the leader does not permit any kind of skepticism or criticism, doubts, or questionings. So, we can see and have seen churches that do operate in this way, where there's very much a touch not the Lord's anointed, and like you cannot say anything against this leader and what they preach because God has placed them in this role. And so they are untouchable, and you should not even really entertain negative thoughts about this person, what they preach.
Hmm.
And the thing about religious groups is that, so like if I was going to start my own cult, I need to secure the buy-in of people around me. I need to convince them that I have something truly special or unique, or something that solves a problem, something
Yeah.
that will fix something in their life. But when you start a cult or a group that's based around Christianity, it's a well-respected religion that people are comfortable with. They're familiar with it. It's been around for a really long time. There's an automatic respect and trust that we give to Christian leaders. So if you want to start a cult, starting it and molding it off of an already established religious tradition means
Mm,
that I'm going to secure people's buy-in a lot quicker than when I
mm,
have to say, you have to read my 300-page book first to understand my ideology before I can convince you. But leveraging off of that familiarity and that historical respect that we have for religious leaders is a kind of a really ingenious shortcut when you think about it.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, shortcut, yes, but obviously, I'd say that most pastors or whatever church leaders are not thinking about that. So it's almost like a situation where you have all these people in cultish environments without even knowing it, or the leaders don't even know, right?
Yeah.
That's
And this
ironic
is
almost.
where, like, when we talk about cults being a spectrum,
Hmm.
that's so true. And that's why you want to be aware of what these red flags are before
Yeah.
your church slides into that extreme end. So, like the authoritarian structure, like, does your pastor actually have any kind of real accountability?
Hmm.
Or is there just kind of the like appearance of accountability? Do they accept people having criticism or having doubts. Like another really big thing I tell people to look for is like, how does your pastor talk? How do they speak about the people that have left the group?
Hmm.
So if they frame them as like defectors or traitors or dissidents or fallen, backslidden people or like bitter people out for revenge, or even like within Christianity, so hear people say that like this person just wanted to live a life where they could sin and do whatever they wanted. So like, how does your pastor or leader frame people that were once a part of the group but are no longer a part of the group? Because the way that they frame that person, it really sends a message about what's acceptable and how they will treat people that choose to walk away. So that tells you about what that leader values. Do they value control and compliance? Or are they okay that not everyone will agree with them and that some people will leave? And that's actually very normal and okay, and not something that should be framed as a threat.
Yeah.
So,
A
yeah.
little more on that topic. So you mentioned how someone might talk negatively about someone that left, like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
whatever excuse they have.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the effect that might have on, obviously that's going to be harmful if that person hears about it, of course.
Yeah.
And whether it's true or not. But on the other hand, is there a harm in like other people in the cult in that environment? Or do you see any potential harm there as far as how they see the situation, or what do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think if a leader is framing something in like a more extreme way, and they're like encouraging people to shun this person or to cut them off, and is saying that they're bitter and they have rejected the faith or they are out to destroy this person. Like what I would want to do is I would want to reality test that if I can. Is that actually true? Like when this person was a part of our community, did they seem like they were power hungry? Or did they seem like they just wanted to live a life
Mhm.
full of sin? Like, how true are these things that the pastor is saying? How true are they? Because that pastor, anyone in a position of authority, they have so much power to control and set the narrative for their own agenda. So to normalize people leaving and to understand that people leave for a variety of reasons and that's okay, is one way, but to frame that person leaving as a threat to your power and as someone who rebelled against you is like such a big red flag. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, that there aren't people that leave churches that actually have very bad intentions and are like malicious and calculated. But if you see that as a pattern, that every person that leaves this church gets like smeared by the pastor from the pulpit, that's like a huge red flag for
Hmm.
sure. And it
That's
sends a
yeah.
message to those congregants that are a part of that church. Like, this is what will happen to you if you leave.
Hmm.
This pastor will slander you in front of everyone. These people that used to be part of your cherished community, they will like rip you to shreds. And they will have full control over the narrative, and their church will believe them. So it also reinforces that leader's control because it sends that message.
Wow. So
Yeah.
there's a big fear dynamic, maybe a little shame. So like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, if I dissent to what the big guy says there, then like bad things are going to happen for me. So I got to really make sure to get into shape. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And the other thing, too, we see with high control groups is that these groups tend to metastasize in such a way that they become an extension of the cult leader or the leader. So then that group is really now acting at every whim of the leader.
Hmm.
So often we will see that means that they will send their followers out to get revenge or to harass those people or intimidate them or to even to try and silence them. Where like a healthy leader is not going to try to weaponize his own followers to suit their own agenda. But yeah, in unhealthy groups, that group becomes an extension of that leader and they weaponize that extension.
Thank you. All right.
Mhm.
Uh, on continuing there. So we've kind of got into it, but could you
Mhm.
talk about just the impact that cults can have on people? So I want to start with positive ones because
Yeah.
I'm not think about it. It's like it's not all bad. Like there are some benefits to this cult atmosphere.
Mhm.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is actually kind of a point of disagreement among different theorists. So some theorists will say cults are inherently harmful. There's no such thing as a benign cult. But then if you just want to describe cult as a group of people that is really devoted to something, then you could describe Taylor Swift's fans as a cult. Um, so yeah, if you're looking at it from that way, more like if you want to say a cult that isn't destructive, then what it actually does is it brings people together who have a shared mindset, shared values, and a shared commitment. And that is so powerful. Finding your people, finding your community, being a part of something and having that belonging and that connection is something that every single human being craves. And in destructive cults, this is what we see being weaponized. But on its face, having this shared belonging and this shared purpose is a really powerful part of our psychology that drives us in a lot of different ways.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like when I think about like positives, I think of like, well, of course, like people want to join them because there's positives, right? Nobody's going to
Mm-hmm.
just go willingly into only negative things, right?
Yeah.
So I guess there's an aspect of like, I mean, I don't know, it's a weird thing because you talked about like the part of it's like there's this special oftentimes there's like some kind of special knowledge and it's
Yeah.
like you feel good because of the special knowledge. So like I guess a positive is you feel good, right? um,
Yeah.
Now maybe that's like an unhealthy version of feeling good. I don't know how to frame that correctly, but um, yeah, no, that's really interesting. Was there anything else as far as positives that you wanted to talk about there before we kept going?
Yeah, I'll just clarify too that, like, for the purposes of this talk and from the
Mm-hmm.
framework that I operate from, when I use the word cult, I'm more talking about like a destructive group,
Mm.
not like a benign fandom or people that all subscribe to like a certain ideology. I'm talking about destructive groups. But also, what you touched on too, when you said like it seems good and like they have access to something special or they claim to offer something that's valuable. And in cults, this is this where the deception starts is that there's
Mm.
very much a bait and switch. So what is initially offered isn't what is actually the core part of this group. And so there's a deception that is present from the very, very beginning is that people aren't really told the full extent of this ideology or the true aims of the leader.
Mm.
There's like a very sanitized, simplified, and more innocent version of it that's used to hook people in. But then once you get into it and they feel that they can trust you and you have more access, then you get a better perspective of what really is the driving force in the agenda of this leader or this group.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, there's a long list of negatives here. So, could you talk about maybe the negatives of being in a
Mm-hmm.
cult? The reason I mentioned this is I can see somebody thinking, okay, like, hey, I get a sense of like identity. I get this
Mm-hmm.
friendship. I get this extra source of knowledge, and sometimes that extra source
Yeah.
of knowledge is like a church. You're learning about the Bible. That's great, right? And
Totally.
so like there's a lot of positives there, and someone might say, okay, like okay, who cares if I'm in a cult environment? Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel hurt by it. Could you talk about the negatives about being in a cult, maybe specifically ones that people aren't typically aware of?
Yeah. So, um, people will often join cults and be drawn into these groups when they are in a very vulnerable situation. So we call this situational vulnerabilities. So every single one of us at different points in our life will be more vulnerable and more susceptible to these groups than at other points in our life. So a big one is when we have just faced a loss. So we might have lost a job, we might have lost a partner, maybe a relationship ended,
Hmm.
and they make us really vulnerable. And so what these groups do is they bring you in on this hope that I don't know, maybe you'll find the true version of you or be able to be a healthy single person. But what they do is that in exchange for membership to this group, you are asked to sacrifice your critical thinking skills and to hand over your autonomy. So at its core, these groups are destructive and harmful because they undercut our own individuality, our uniqueness. And cults, their end game is to turn us into really like carbon copies of each other, because the goal of cults and high control groups is to exert their control over us. So what they want is they want our compliance. So you might go into it thinking that this ideology or this person actually gave me hope and it has brought me out of this depression that I've been drowning in. But at a certain point, to stay a part of that group, you will have to surrender your own autonomy. And so it may seem like you gain something, but actually you are losing out on the things that protect us from harmful influence and the very psychological strengths that allow us to identify and to leave harmful and controlling people and situations. So it's really a trap. And that's why I like to call cults like a bait and switch. But yeah, like I have so much sympathy for people that are drawn into these groups because initially it feels like someone just handed you a lifeline when you were drowning or has come up with an answer to a question that has haunted you forever. And those claims give us hope and they help us to push forward in life. And so initially, I can see how these things are so alluring and enticing. And there's honestly like a cult out there with like for every single person in this world. So people will say like I would never join a cult. And I always tell them like I guarantee you there's a cult with your name on it. There's a cult that you will find so enticing and alluring for the exact season of life that you are in that will be very hard to figure out what's happening until it's too late. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's deep there. So
Mhm.
on on that same topic there, kind of a continuation of my question there. So some people might be watching and be like, okay, so it sounds like I'm in what you're talking about,
Mhm.
and I do notice there's a lot of negatives there,
Mhm.
but maybe it's still worth it. What do you think about that? Do you think it's worth it to stay in a cult if they're like, oh, I'll just shy away from the negative stuff and only get the positive out of it? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, at a certain point, you will not be able to be that selective with what you adhere to in these groups because by their very nature they're totalitarian. So they ask for more and more from you and they demand more and more from you. So if there is this sense that you're still in it in such a way that you still have perspective and you can pick and choose what parts you want to adhere to or what beliefs you want to adopt, at a certain point that won't be the case. But if you still feel that way, that's actually a good sign that the group actually maybe isn't as destructive or that you're still able to maintain some perspective and that critical thinking. But if it is a destructive group or a cult, it's only a matter of time before they snuff out that critical thinking.
Do you think there's an aspect of like I'll just be honest, like most
Mhm.
people that I maybe have issues with boundaries or not as up to date on the psychological aspects of things, like most people in cults don't know they're being controlled and all that. So I can't
Yeah.
think I can't help but think that's like, okay, so you might be in a cult and you're like, okay, I'm cool with it, but like, do you really know what's going on? What do you think about that? And could you maybe talk about if aspects of that are maybe more difficult for people to notice, like, oh, okay, my bad, like I didn't know I'm being controlled, but you're right about that or something like that, you know?
Yeah. And this is the sophisticated campaign of persuasion and indoctrination that happens in cults, is that it's very gradual, and there's a process that they are moving you along that you don't have knowledge and awareness of. Um, and so it is extremely common that people in cults, for a large part of their participation, have no clue that it's a cult. But what they do have is they have these little niggling doubts and questions in their brain. They maybe see something that kind of concerns them, but what they do is they just put it to the back of their head. And they just say, like, I'm just going to put that on the back burner for now. So, like, maybe they feel like there's been accusations of their group leader being unethical towards certain people or like abusive. But for this person at that point, there's still more benefits to be gained than there are. It's the cost of being in the group isn't as high. It doesn't outweigh the benefits being gained. So what people in these groups will do is that Yanya Lalit, she's a cult theorist, and she has this metaphor. She talks about it's like a shelf in your brain, at the back of your brain. And on that shelf, you put these like little questions or concerns, or like this newspaper headline that accused your leader of something, but you don't really believe it. You don't think it's true, but it still goes on this shelf in the back of your head. And at some point, something gets placed on that shelf that is so heavy that breaks that shelf. And it's that day where everything comes crumbling down, and you start to think like, maybe those people were right, or maybe there really are grave abuses going on in this group, and maybe it's actually not worth it for me to be a part of it. But for each individual, that shelf and how long it takes for that shelf to break, that can really vary, depending on what kind of cult it is and how close they are to the leader, the perceived benefit they're getting, what they've been exposed to. But yeah, every single person in these groups will have this shelf where there's been like kind of things where they're like, ooh, that seems like a little bit off, or like, ooh, that belief is kind of fringe, or like the leader seems a bit racist, but like I still really believe what he's saying. But that leader seems a bit racist. That thought goes on the shelf. So what I ask people to do who are in these groups, who are like, I'm pretty sure it's not a cult, is to occasionally have a look at what's on that shelf. Just take stock of it, because the psychological control that is fostered in these groups means that you don't get to action, you don't get to have curiosity about things that are negative about the leader. And so the degree to which you feel like safe to entertain these thoughts and ideas is the degree to which you still have a certain amount of psychological safety. So people in these groups get so controlled and so conditioned to hand over critical thinking that they actually don't have any safety or space to even for a second consider the fact that their leader is exploitative and harmful. So what you'll see with people in these groups is this knee-jerk jump to defending the leader and to being like, it can't be true. I could not believe that. So when you see that knee-jerk reaction, that means that there's a huge amount of psychological control that they can't even hold that thought for a second. It's they can't tolerate that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that's difficult. So
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple thoughts there. One, you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about how um, there can be, different reasons why, people will be in there. I can't help but think that some of it's like, I've already been in this for so long. I've devoted so much of my effort, my time, like I'm not going to just throw this all away. It's like
Yeah,
this sunk cost fallacy idea. Um,
exactly.
but I also want, you mentioned how like you put things on the shelf, like, hey, if they might have been a jerk to Susie over there, but they got this great
That wasn't
knowledge.
my
So
experience.
yeah, right. Oh,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that might have been that bad thing might have happened in the past, but that's not affecting anybody now, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Or he lied about this, but it's okay. He's going to be trustworthy over here in this situation. But um, I can't help but think, like, from my own experience of, like, thinking about, like, I guess whether I think about these negative thoughts or whatever. Like,
Hmm.
and if I'm putting myself in the cult member's mindset that, of course, doesn't know they're in a cult, they're probably thinking, like, all these good things. I'm not gonna think about the bad things because, like, I can't even fathom those. Like, that's just terrible. So, like,
Yeah.
I can't help but imagine, like, maybe there's a lot of anxiety with that. Maybe I'm just speaking nonsense, and it's like I'm not gonna think about it at all. I'm just gonna run away from that. I'm never gonna think about it ever. Um,
Yeah.
do you think that is, like, practical? Do you, like, people actually think like that, or am I just off on with, like, no evidence, or what? What are you thinking there?
Yeah. That, like, a large part of what you just talked about is really summed up in this concept of cognitive dissonance,
Hmm.
that we reflexively cannot tolerate these two competing ideas at the same time. And so we have to guard one idea more because as human beings, we are not great with holding on to doubts or questions. Because if you think about the way our psychology is, our drive to survive and our drive to for self-preservation is so strong that if we have committed to a group or an ideology and really bought in, it's too painful to think about that we might be wrong, that we might be in a group that is destructive or the leader has abused people. It's too painful to consider that. And so that cognitive dissonance and that cognitive inflexibility feels so uncomfortable, like you cannot tolerate it. And this is actually what will fuel people to go even deeper into these groups because they can't really sit on the fence. And so they will actually become even more dependent on this leader or on this ideology because they can't straddle the fence. It's intolerable. And so, in this way, this is why we know that questioning people to their face or shouting, "You're in a cult, why can't you see it?" is just not the way to go because it will drive that person further into that group or that ideology. And so it will just increase their isolation and it will fuel this sense of rigidity in their brain that they will just reflexively continue to push away anything that counters what they believe. And so, if you can imagine, like, that is the result of a sustained, calculated campaign of psychological control and influence and indoctrination that brings that person to this point. And so that is like a powerful thing in a group, is that if people question you, it just drives you further. Or if your leader has accusations against them, it will foster this persecution complex, which adds this to the sense of like specialness of this group and of this leader, is that people want to destroy him because he has the truth and people don't want to see the truth. So, like, often persecution and pushback can actually just lead people to retreat even deeper into these beliefs.
Yeah, that's really difficult because you could see someone, like, wants to really help them, but it backfires in that way.
Yeah.
And I can see that, like, the typical person that wants that is in a cult is often going to be the type of person that's gonna, like, rebel against that, critique or whatever. So yeah,
Hmm.
like those are the specific persons you don't want to do that to, right?
Yeah.
um,
And
yeah, that's
also,
wild.
like, there's also a sense of superiority to feel like you have it all figured out. Your ideology, your way of living, your leader has the true answers, the truth about the world. We are awake, everyone else is asleep. There's like a special status, like it feels very like there's a superiority, like you're part of a special group. And that is also what causes people to stay in these groups, is that really feels like a special place of belonging and like a very exclusive community. And that really scratches an itch for us, like as human beings, to feel like we are a part of an elite few.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you have any other thoughts before we keep going there?
No, I mean, I could talk about this stuff forever. So
Yeah.
if you want to, yeah,
Okay,
move
let's keep
along to
going.
other questions, because
Yeah.
I will talk forever.
Okay. All right. So, yeah. So let's talk about. I mean, you brought this up here already, so maybe we can brush over it if you want to. But could you talk more about why people turn a blind eye to like the red flags?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's because this is a part of that gradual process where people are slowly being brought into this group, being exposed to this ideology. And it's so gradual and step by step that it isn't necessarily this like big flashing red lights or red flags that people think it is. But by the time they do see a red flag, they've already kind of been trained to discount it or to disbelieve the source of that, or to even create like a justification for why that leader would need to scream at that person, or like why that leader would need to threaten or intimidate this ex group member. Um, so by the time you get to that point, they've already developed in you this way of thinking that excuses those things and that explains away these red flags. And so that's why it's like actually very hard to see the red flags for what they are and respond accordingly, because these groups are very strategic and methodical. So, right out of the gate, they aren't going to expose you to the dark underbelly of this group, or the trail of wreckage that has been left behind, the families that have been torn apart, or the psychological breakdowns that have occurred when people have left. They're going to cover all of that stuff up because it doesn't serve them. And so that's why, in this way, these groups are inherently deceptive and manipulative. So it's like never that simple to just see a red flag, recognize it, and act accordingly. They've already conditioned you to deflect that and to explain it away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. All
Mm-hmm.
right. So here's a very important question. So, what should people do if they are in a cult?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is, um, yeah, it's tough. It depends what kind of cult you are and what kind of jeopardy you're facing. Like, are you actually like in physical danger? Could you lose everything? Like, could this person take all of your financial resources? Like, what will you lose if you leave this group? And so that's really going to dictate how you exit this group. But usually, what I like to tell people is to be able to create kind of an exit plan as much as you can. So, and how that usually starts is by slowly pushing back against the isolation. So in these groups, they will have like things that you're allowed to read, things that you're not allowed to read, people you're allowed to talk to, people you're not allowed to talk to. So when you're preparing to leave or you think that you want a way out, starting to push back on that isolation will help you figure out your next steps. So one way, if you feel safe and it's appropriate and you can do it without facing reprisal or like harassment from your leaders, is to meet up with like an ex group member, or like have a phone call, meet for coffee, and connect with someone that was once in your place, because they will have a really good perspective on what it takes to leave and what the cost was for them. And maybe they can help you avoid some of those things, or at least connect you to resources and other safe people. So often there's like lots of great groups on Facebook full of like ex members or people that have left certain groups or ideologies. And that can be a good place to start if you have that privacy and that safety, is to just poke around some of these groups and see if there's a way that you can build a safe connection to someone that's outside of that group and that has left that group.
Yeah, that's really difficult, I would assume, because
Yeah.
your leaders probably spent all of this time thinking that person's terrible, and you're
Yeah,
asking, hey, go talk to that person and know about their
totally.
experiences, right? So I'm
Yeah,
sure there's a lot of conflicting thoughts there.
yeah. But that's usually what I see so many people do, is that they will reach out to a previous group member and like very tentatively be like, I heard you left because of this. Like, is
Mm,
that true? Or like, often group members have a lot of fear about the outside world or what will happen if they leave. So, like, if they reach out to an ex member and that member is actually doing okay, and they're like, whatever was said to be happening to them isn't happening, it can just plant some hope in that person that, like, they actually can leave. But yeah, these first steps, pushing back against the isolation, and then also starting to understand the extent of the control that is operating in like the way that you think about things. So like that's one thing that I help people with a lot in my services, is to start to look through this lens of like what has been controlled and manipulated in the way that you think about things and perceive things. Where is that control and how is it impacting you? So yeah, even just like I said, pushing back against that isolation and starting to untangle some of the psychological control that exists. And there's so many great resources out there. So it's just about having that safety to be like private and by yourself, that you could like look at that book on Kindle, or you could like send a message to that ex group member. But yeah, making contact with the outside is going to give you some of those first steps to prepare you to leave that group.
yeah. Yeah. So you talked about a lot about isolation. So
Mhm.
oftentimes in these cults, of course, you have this aspect of like, hey, the people in the cult are like, don't talk to the people outside the cult. Don't
Yeah,
listen to anything. Don't do anything like that. So that eventually, what happens if you ever decide, hey, I want to leave this, is like, well, I've got nothing now. I have no
yeah.
friends, and it's just like really compounds. It's like, okay, maybe it's just better to stay in that case. So that
Exactly. And
makes it
you
really
you don't
difficult.
trust the outside world, and you also don't trust yourself, because that is what that group leader and that ideology does so masterfully, is they make you dependent on them and they undercut your own ability to think critically. So it's just terrifying to think that maybe you should trust yourself because you've seen some things that you cannot unsee and you think that you want out. That is such a scary place to be.
Hmm.
But nobody has to do it alone. And there are so many people out there that can help you. And so, yeah, just pushing back in like baby steps against that isolation and like talking back to that fear that has been cultivated in your brain about the outside world and these outsiders.
Right, yeah. So you don't have to just leave immediately, although some people that might be better, but
Yeah,
you don't have to leave immediately. So you can like basically, make friends or slowly come out so that when you're ready to officially come out, like you've got almost another identity, another environment that you can thrive in outside of it. Is that the good way to put it?
yeah. So actually, it's not as rosy as that. We often see people moving from like one cult to another,
Mm,
because when you leave one of these groups, it
mm,
feels like the rug has been pulled out from under you. And because of that, the sense of being lost and disillusioned and defeated and helpless makes you really susceptible to being drawn into another group. So it can actually take quite a while to build up that trust in yourself again, because that self trust is such a thing that these groups destroy and target. And so that takes time. And that's why connecting with people that have left, or like a good therapist who understands coercive control and brainwashing, can like help you start to build up that self trust again.
yeah, that is really interesting. I did
Mm-hmm.
want to ask you about that, so I appreciate you can bring that up. So there is an aspect of, well, oftentimes someone will go from one cult to another. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought about it as like it's just like a specific personality that people have that, or maybe like it has to do with like bias of like people that get a good feeling from like that secret knowledge are more likely to just
Mm-hmm.
keep looking for that secret knowledge somewhere else, or maybe all they're looking for is identity, so they'll find it any way possible. That kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you've thought about it as the idea of like they lost it, like, so yeah, they basically, they like, maybe they feel like they have nothing, so
Hmm.
they're gonna just go and find the next essentially cult. Of course they're gonna do it not realizing that it's a cult, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Because when you place that trust and authority in an outside person or ideology or belief system, you will always be vulnerable to these groups because what's missing is your own trust in yourself and also your ability to tolerate uncertainty. Because what these groups offer is like a dogma, a black and white thinking. We have all the answers. This is the way it is. There's no nuance. Here is the knowledge that you need. So to willingly walk away from that tells me that that is actually a very strong and resilient person that is like fighting back by listening to that voice in their head saying that they need to leave. So people who leave these groups are incredibly strong. It's just about when they leave, having them be connected with people that can build up that self-trust and to
Hmm.
build up that capacity to tolerate that uncertainty, because these fundamentalist groups or these very dogmatic groups, they actually feel they can feel very regulating for your nervous system. So, especially like if you grew up in a household where there was violence or abuse, there was a lot of chaos and unpredictability. So, having someone who so confidently declares that they have the truth and this is the truth is very alluring. So, it in a way can make you feel very regulated, your nervous system. But what we need to build up in that person is not this need to always be looking for to outside sources to build that security, but to be able to exist with the uncertainty and to be able to have that self-determination and that autonomy to seek out things that can help them and build them, but not in a way that they're just handing over their critical thinking to another group or another ideology that gives you the answer or the solution.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So uh, on the similar note there, so there's the question of if you know someone else who's in a cult. So it's like, you know, I myself wouldn't be in a cult, but my friend is who's clearly in a cult and they just don't know what to do,
Yeah.
and they're being stubborn about it. So how do you address, not address, but how someone that is worried about their friend or whatever that is in a cult or they think's in
Yeah.
a cult, how do you go about that conversation and I don't know, opening eyes? Or I mean, like,
Yeah.
I actually had a friend recently that was like, "Hey, you're in a cult," and I'm like to myself, I'm like, I don't even know if he's in a cult. So like, so like,
Mhm.
I don't know if calling someone that they're in a cult is when they don't even think they're in a cult, and like it's not even clear that they're in a cult to begin with. Probably not a good approach. But
Yeah.
yeah, anyways, back to the original question. So you're like, what should people do if they think their friend's in a cult?
Yeah. So what you want to do is you really want to maintain that relationship, because that relationship, if that person is in a cult, can be that off ramp off of that highway within that high control group. So maintaining that connection is a way out of that isolation. And in that relationship, you want to keep it positive. So you want to have curiosity, but not condemnation or accusation, but just like a true curiosity in that you care for this person, you care about their well being, but you want to be able to figure out like what has drawn them into this group. So in these groups there are needs that are being met. So how is this group or ideology meeting needs in this person, and how is that something that maybe you can meet that need or you can care for that person in that way so that they don't have as much of a dependence and need for this group. But yeah, the big thing is trying to maintain any kind of connection you can with them and keeping it positive and curious and caring and not accusations. Yeah. And also, unless they're like in immediate danger, you don't want to forcibly remove them from that group because in that way you're also undermining their own ability to make decisions that are in their best interest and to act on their own behalf. So unless that person is in critical danger, you don't want to force them against their will to make decisions, But yeah, being that person on the outside. And the other thing that does is that you are not a part of that group. You didn't buy into that ideology. And it's the people that are in this ideology or that group that are supposed to be thriving because they have these answers. So if you can show that you're outside of this and you actually have a good life, you experience joy, you experience pleasure, you experience curiosity, it pushes back against this reality that the group is trying to enforce, that like, there's nothing good outside of this group. Like, you never want to leave this group because there's nothing redemptive outside of it. So you're also pushing back against that kind of programming that's happening.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that is really good advice about the friend. So like if you're wanting to or considering leaving the cult, like you have to, maybe you don't have to, but a really good helpful thing is having that base of like friendship, something, the idea like it's not going to be terrible if you leave. Like you're going to have some type of support.
Yeah.
So it, so being that friend, it can be enough to actually help them get out of it. You don't even have to have the conversation about being in a cult, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're just a safe outside person that has proven that you can live and function and thrive outside of this space. Um, and so you represent a possibility for that person that maybe there is something positive that exists outside.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So next, let's see here. Yeah, so here's a fun one. So I'm really curious on this one. So how would you say that cult dynamics can affect how people read the Bible? So this is going to be real important for people that are actually like, concerned about like my
Yeah.
topic of like the Bible and stuff like that. So I can think of maybe like what your pastors like controlling how you read it and fear and what do you have to think about all that stuff?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing about the Bible, and I mean, this is why we have so many different denominations, is that as much as it seems like everything's there in black and white, there are so many different ways to interpret scripture and different things to emphasize or different things that we don't emphasize as much. And so, when we have, let's say, like a controlling church, um, or a culty church, they will really emphasize certain parts of scripture over other parts. And those parts of scripture are ones that tend to stir up shame in the congregants. So a lot of like, you are like lower than garbage, and like you were just so lucky that Jesus loves you and that we accept you in this community because you're basically garbage. You deserve nothing. You deserve death. But thank goodness that Christ died for you and we have this hope. So when you have messages that really focus on how you're not really worth much and you have no value and worthiness apart from this group and this teaching and um, outside of your church and your beliefs, that makes you very susceptible to control and to manipulation and deception. So having churches that also focus on legalism and like very much a performative element where confession is like can be used as a tool for control. So where there's really a lopsided picture of the gospel in terms of Christ's redemption and how we are broken image bearers, but we still have value and worth. And even though we fall and we mess up, we have inherent value and worth. That kind of framing, other than the focus on how your heart is deceptive above all things and your emotions are bad and you can't listen to anything that comes through. So there's just different framings, and some of them, yeah, will make you very vulnerable to shame and to control, and others will feel like there's still value in you as a person. You're not a broken down like piece of garbage that like should have been discarded. There's hope and there's beauty because God created you. So that kind of framing is important. And then just the other thing too is that freedom to ask questions. So like if your pastor is preaching something and you have questions about the other ways that people talk about doctrines around hell, Like, are you free to ask those questions? Are you free to do a Google search on what other theologians think about this passage? So for pastors that believe that their denomination or even their church is like really preaching the one real true interpretation of this passage, that's like a red flag. So anything that brings more control and less freedom is going to make you a lot more vulnerable to abuse and to control.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
other thing too, I would say too, within like Christianity specifically, is that this kind of really treating the pastor as God. So where the pastor is like this sacred connection to God, as if we each don't have the Holy Spirit and we each don't have the ability to read the scripture for ourselves. And so that's a really big red flag, is if you're taught that you can only hang on to the interpretation and words of scripture through the mouth of your pastor, not through your own discovery and personal revelation. That's a very lopsided and controlling type of participation in your church or doctrine or any of those.
right, yeah.
Yeah,
So in a lot of ways, living in a cult environment and getting some of that knowledge about the Bible from like your cult leaders and all that from that atmosphere can really affect pretty much any topic related to the Bible
totally.
in that case.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's
yeah.
really important. It's like if you are you care about the Bible, like that's got to be really important. Like, hey, let's just make sure we're not being influenced by those outside things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And
And
if scripture is being used to protect your pastor from accountability,
hmm,
this whole idea. So, like, a church that I was a part of was very much like a touch not the Lord's anointed. So, the way that they used scripture actually insulated that pastor from any kind of real accountability. But like each one of us can be called to repentance. And like we all have the Holy Spirit. So even that kind of thing where it's actually just giving the pastor more power. Yeah, I see that a lot.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah. So something that's also really interesting for me that I'm curious about is you and I talked about this idea of like thought terminating cliche. So like
Yeah.
cult members and maybe the cult leader in general will have oftentimes have this like thought process of like uh, a cult member will basically say like certain phrases or have certain ways of thinking that just cut off all like critical thought. Like, so someone will
Yeah.
say, hey, that's not right about, whatever, the Bible or this or that. And someone will be like,
Yeah.
say something that like just that doesn't matter. Your logic doesn't matter. Like, we're going to talk about this instead. Could you talk about like how that is often in cults and like how that comes about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all cults will have a version of what we call a thought terminating cliche. And it's like a way to just stop any kind of questions or doubts dead in their tracks. And it can look like different things, but for example, in Christianity, we might hear it in the form of like, God's thoughts are so much higher and above our thoughts, or God's ways, we cannot always understand them. So that's true, but if that is being used as an answer to a valid concern that you have or a question, then what it's doing is that is operating as a form of control and getting you to just stop running any further down that road of exploring that question or that concern that you had. So, another one with other groups is like that it's just flat out wrong to have doubts or to have questions. So, like the leader knows best and the leader has higher knowledge. So, they might tell their followers, you actually don't even have the capacity to understand this. But what that says is that don't even bother trying to figure this out or trying to think if there's some double speak going on because you just can't comprehend it. Like this leader's brain and the way that he thinks, his expertise, his knowledge is just so far above us and beyond us. Like you can't even comprehend it. And so it shuts down critical thinking And that is what we call a thought terminating cliche. And this is a very frequent feature of high control groups, is some version of that, just stopping you dead in your tracks. Or it could be like this mantra that when you have doubts or questions, that's a sign that you're not trusting the leader. And that lack of trust is sinful or wrong. And so you might just say to yourself, oh, I just got to trust. Like, stop. I trust in the knowledge that I have, or I trust in this leader. And so it just stops that questioning like right away. But it doesn't really provide an answer. It's like a non-answer, and it's really like a deflection.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I can't help but think like, pastors and other, I don't like to say pastors are cult leaders, but it seems like there is if there's some churches are cults or cult-like, then I guess some
Mm-hmm.
pastors are cult leaders, right?
Absolutely. Sadly. Yeah.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah.
Um, coming from a Christian, but yeah. So if some pastors will like, oftentimes they'll say, hey, like, the scholars, they're yada yada yada, they're sinful or whatever. They'll talk bad about the scholars. But also only think about like what I'm thinking about, right? Only trust me. You can't trust the scholars, the people who
Yeah.
actually know it. Only me is that. So like, I can't help but think that if someone says that, like, well, if the scholars don't even know it, then how would I even know it myself, right? If I'm a leader, or not a leader, but a follower of that cult. Like, if they spend all their time to think about it, if they can't do that, I can't, then I certainly can't do that. So I should just
Yeah.
trust him. Do you think that's a popular thought?
Yeah, this idea that we really can't even grasp what's right or wrong because the other people who are experts on this area, they're not right. They're misinformed, they're misled. But then that leader who claims to have that true interpretation faces no kind of critical evaluation. And I always like, it comes back down to this for me, is that don't you want to know that what you believe you have wrestled with and you have fought through and you have asked the hard questions? A belief or an ideology that can't be questioned, is that really one that's worth defending? Is that really one that you want to give your life over to? That does not withstand scrutiny, that you can't ask questions or have doubts? Is that really the kind of mindset that you want to have? Or do you want to be someone that when you believe something, you know that you have tested it, that you have wrestled with it, that you have asked questions, that you have that psychological safety to listen to someone when they say, this scripture says this and your God does this, that you're able to really engage with that person? Yeah, are the things that we believe should stand up to scrutiny. And if you feel like you can't even begin to ask questions or to ask for a further understanding or a clarification on something, then that belief or ideology does not stand up to scrutiny. And is that what you want to be devoted to? I think we all deserve to have more freedom of mind than to be so small minded and reflexively defensive against any perceived criticism of what we believe.
Right. Yeah, I can't help but think that, like, everything you said is true, but if I'm going to think in the mind of the cult follower, I'm probably going to be like, well, I don't think that I'm just deflecting. I don't think that I am, um, just like not questioning them.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't. It's like, I I mean, I don't know. I'm not a cult follower that I know of, but I imagine that someone is probably not going to be like, yeah, I would think they would think, okay, there's no reason to question him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I guess if someone's listening, they're like, well, you say I am a cult follower, but I don't find myself just not questioning them. I just don't question them, but I just can't think of any examples. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay with questioning them if it's deserved, right? But they just don't question. Like, I don't know. Am I making any sense? Like, how would what could you say to someone in that situation that, like, I mean, maybe a point like, hey, maybe you are actually like not being critical enough about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if um, if you are unwilling to look outside of your echo chamber, if you are in an echo chamber, then that's already a sign that there is a level of psychological and thought control being exerted over you. So to those people, I would say that their way of trying to convince themselves that there's not even an issue points to me that there actually is already kind of a fortress built up around this ideology that you can't question it. And maybe that person feels okay at that point right now, but every person should feel like they have the safety to explore and to ask questions. So I just hope that when those people who say, like, there is no reason to doubt, so I'm not even being defensive, there's just no other valid criticisms of my ideology, I would just ask them to hold on to this, that what they deserve is to have that psychological freedom and that freedom of mind to ask questions. So I want them to remember that when they do reach a point where they do have questions or doubts, or where someone else is saying something that counters or criticizes what they believe, I want them to think the mark of being in a safe and healthy group is that I can engage with these and it doesn't trigger my defenses. Because at some point they will reach a crossroads like that. Like I said, where that shelf in the back of their mind is getting really heavy, and that will break one day. And every person deserves to have freedom of mind and to have freedom of consciousness, and to be able to live their life by the values that they hold. So I just hope that when they get to that point, they remember that and they give themselves that opportunity to really engage with these criticisms and with these disagreements.
Yeah.
But yeah, for someone who is like comfortably in it and is like, I don't even need to pay attention to what other people are saying, there's not really much we can say to that, except that for me, it's a value that I can robustly engage with alternative viewpoints, but maybe they've convinced themselves that that's not one of their values.
Yeah, that's really difficult. If
Yeah.
it's like, how can you help someone that has their ears closed, right?
Yeah.
That's difficult.
Yeah. Totally.
So, an really interesting one is the idea of hazing. So I honestly don't know a lot about hazing, and the reason I say it is, I mean, like, I don't have like experiences with people being hazed, like,
Yeah.
except for very rare circumstances. Like, I have a couple of friends that were in like frat houses or something like that. So is hazing common in cult environments? How does that look like? And maybe like, what are the negatives of that if it is something that's common?
Yeah, I feel like when you first asked me that question, when we were talking before, I kind of was like, no, there isn't hazing, but it's because they don't really see it that way or wouldn't really use that label for it, but it is still hazing. And the way that I kind of conceptualize that is that when you're a part of these groups, there are loyalty tests. So there are moments where that leader or that ideology is telling you to do something for the betterment of the group or to support the public facing image of the group or the reputation of the leader, but it actually violates or goes against a value that you hold. And so that is a loyalty test. So we see this sometimes in like certain groups or secretive cults will have like an initiation ritual. So anything that is some kind of test or challenge, loyalty test that a person has to pass to be welcomed into a deeper level of the group or to climb up the hierarchy, we could definitely compare that to hazing. And so we're looking for things that involve like humiliation, embarrassing someone, shaming someone, like degrading someone. And so these tests, when it comes to this, is are you willing to surrender your image of yourself and to be degraded or humiliated in exchange for membership to this group? So right there, that's a loyalty test. And it's a very effective way for leaders to determine who is committed to this. Already at this point, that leader is testing that person's boundaries, and they're wondering if you'll pass their test. Will you submit to being humiliated and degraded as a part of this group? Because if you don't, they don't want you as a follower, because they want people that are compliant. And the other role that hazing or these kind of initiation rituals can involve is what we call like a coerced complicity. So when you are forced to turn around and humiliate or degrade someone else, it makes you complicit in a way that you now own that secrecy in that group. So now you're a part of that. So it can really strengthen this sense of commitment and loyalty to each other. But now you're a part of that secrecy and that shame, and you have perpetuated it. So it actually brings you much deeper into that group. So people who will have a harder time leaving high control groups are the people who have forced complicity on other people in ways that include humiliation or degradation. And in those moments, they switch from being a victim to a perpetrator, and they take on more responsibility for that secrecy and the abuse of that group, that it makes it that much harder to leave, because they think in their brain, I'm not a victim, I also perpetuated this, and I'm also a part of this secrecy and this forcing this humiliation on other people. So yeah, whether you want to call it hazing or like a loyalty test, it serves those two functions in testing that person's commitment to the overall group at the expense of debasing their self. And then it also forces them to be complicit and to have a larger role in perpetuating this shame or humiliation of other group members. And so it brings them in much deeper into that group, that it's harder to leave.
Yeah, that's really helpful there. All
Mm-hmm.
right, and kind of changes the topic there. Could you talk about some examples of undercutting critical thinking skills?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, uh, I guess the goal is to people that maybe that might be participating in those. Um, could you give some examples of like, oh, it's like, oh shoot, I do that, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Could you just to help people out there?
Yeah, so undercutting critical thinking skills is really a way to condition a level of compliance in people. So the leader is going to systematically break down things that oppose that compliance and that conformity. So our critical thinking can be broken down in lots of ways. In fact, our human psychology is actually very fragile and way more susceptible to pressure and coercion than we would like to believe. So our critical thinking skills can be undermined in like a very basic way by using kind of the carrot and the stick. So we call it intermittent positive reinforcement. So what happens is that when you question a leader, you get pointed out in front of everyone and shamed and called all these vicious things and humiliated. So that is a form of negative reinforcement. But you decide to not read this article that's questioning your group, and instead you go to the leader and decide to spend more time with them. And so they reward you with more access, or they make you feel good about your commitment to trusting this leader. And that's like this positive reinforcement. So how we break people down and undercut people's critical thinking is we use this carrot and the stick intermittently, and that type of psychological pressure on a person is like very destabilizing. And so at a certain point, the pressure to conform and to at least outwardly make yourself look compliant and trusting and like a good group member, that outweighs the risk and harm of like your doubts and questions and of entertaining these thoughts. And so they really just incentivize complicity and shutting down that critical thinking, and they punish anything that will demonstrate that you still are engaging in that critical thinking. And so that's actually the process that every person in these group will go through. But the group is so skilled at making this so sophisticated and calculated that that person won't realize that. And that's why people don't realize they're in cults, but then they reflexively have a response to defend that group against any kind of criticism. So they've already gotten to that point where their critical thinking has been disengaged. But yeah, it's just the carrot and the stick. And it's a gradual behavioral conditioning using threats of punishment or like rewards of good treatment by the group or like better access or like ascending up the hierarchy. So it's using that system of intermittent positive reinforcement that tells you that it's not worth it to have critical thinking, but it's more worth it to shut it down and to demonstrate your loyalty to this group. So it's just a gradual process of conditioning.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Wow.
Sorry, that was
So
a really long answer to that.
no, then you got into what I was hoping you would talk about, which is kind of like the why people in cults maybe tend to have or use more of these undercutting critical thinking skills, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's so you explained how it's it's kind of based on like maybe the leaders almost instill that on the followers,
Yeah.
and therefore that they're more likely to do it. That's really interesting. Do you think
Mm-hmm.
there is more to that, or is that I guess maybe just like the primary tactic that cult leaders use, or are there any other ways that kind of gets not forced on, but like people are trained to undercut their thinking?
Yeah. So there's actually so many like tactics, psychological tactics, emotional tactics. There's somatic tactics where
Hmm.
you are eliciting a physiological response that the group leaders use to affirm a certain set of beliefs and to disregard other beliefs. So this is actually, it could be like a whole other podcast, but like there's all these tactics that prime people to surrender that critical thinking. Um, and one thing that I think is super interesting, and this will be different in different groups, but Robert J. Lifton, who did this pioneering research on brainwashing and thought reform, and he worked with Chinese citizens who had been sent to these education camps, and also with American prisoners of war during the Korean War. And he helped us understand this process of brainwashing. And he talks about in his research what he calls mystical manipulation. And this is where they give people a subjective experience to ground their beliefs to that will fight off the objective criticisms or doubts about a belief system. So, for an example, like in the context that I'm from, like within Christianity, if you see so these displays of mystical manipulation, they really cement your belief in this leader and in this belief system. So if we see these like televangelists and like healing prophets and like speakers on TV who seem to really have divine knowledge of different people. So they will call out like so and so with her back pain who was in a car accident. And they just seem to have these really specific knowledge that proves that this leader is reputable. But then when you peel back the layers, you find out that that was all manufactured, that a week earlier they had asked people for prayer requests. And the wife of that televangelist is on the earpiece like saying it to the televangelist that there's a lady with a lower back pain from a car accident who lives on a street that starts with the letter N. So it seems like this mystical, magical moment that can ground people in a really subjective way that's really hard to fight back against because they're like, but I had this moment where I felt this in this way and it was so powerful and I can't explain it, but it fights back on the objective criticisms of this group. There's this other one where when people knelt before this leader, I can't remember his name, they felt this tingling sensation through their whole body. And it turned out that this leader had set up this electrical current to be connected to the platform in front of his chair so that when people knelt before him and he gave them a blessing, that tingling and buzzing was actually this manufactured mystical manipulation, but it was this subjective experience that people held on to forever. They felt it when they knelt before him and he touched their forehead. They felt it and it was unexplainable. And that will protect them from criticisms or like objective realities about what they're seeing. So that can be a really powerful way to undermine critical thinking in a way that people are saying, I can't explain it, but I'm okay with that because I just know in my heart that what I felt or experienced was true. And it was proof of this teacher or this ideology, but it's actually been manipulated and manufactured when you look behind the scenes. So that's a really powerful way to undercut someone's critical thinking, is to create these magical experiences. But yeah, I
Yeah.
love those stories. I'm sure you can think of those stories too from people you've heard, that behind the scenes, there's actually very reasonable and logical explanations that explain how they had that knowledge or that power or that understanding.
Yeah. Well, my first thought is like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times in life where we have almost emotional responses.
Yeah.
That's how I would characterize it, as
Yeah.
emotional. Is that a good way to put it, or would you characterize it a different way?
So like undermining someone's critical thinking, you can do it in so many different ways, and you
Yeah.
can use emotional manipulation. So for sure, that is a really powerful way. And there's so many tactics that would fall within that category.
Yeah.
You can also use physiological ones. So through chanting or certain kinds of breathing,
Hmm.
it literally depletes the brain of oxygen and it makes this person feel like they are in an altered state of reality, but it's really because their brain is starving for oxygen. So
Wow.
there's different practices in these groups that can be used to create experiences that undermine your critical thinking, whether it's physiological, psychological, emotional. Yeah, lots of different tactics.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. So I don't want to take too much of your time here. What one last thing there. So you talked about like pretty concrete ways people can pretty much manipulate people
Mm-hmm.
to believing whatever they want, essentially
Yeah.
brainwashing, as you said. But maybe could you talk more about just like, I don't know, examples that maybe not even the cult leader does, but the cult followers do. So you talked about like, God's wills are, or God's ways
Mm-hmm.
are his ways or whatever. You can't, like that just cuts off critical thinking. What are some other ways that critical thinking is undercut like that? Just practical examples.
Yeah. So like that isolation is a really key part. So if you can convince someone that reading other outside sources or newspapers is like to the detriment of that person, or even like an illegal or forbidden behavior, that will start to chip away at their critical thinking. The other thing too is that, like you were talking about, our emotional experiences can actually undermine and overwhelm our ability to think critically. So, for example, when people join these groups or are being recruited into these groups, they will often do this practice called love bombing, where you feel wanted and like they really want you to be a part of their group because they think you're so smart and like they could really use a person like you in their group, and like you just seem like you have so much to offer, and they really overwhelm you with flattery and charm. And like we're more susceptible to that kind of thing than we really think we are, but that is just a form of emotional manipulation. And I just had another thought about another one, but it just jumped out of my brain. Oh, yeah. So, all right, I thought I had it back and then I didn't. Um,
Darn.
yeah, love bombing. There was another one that had to do with. Sorry, it's gone.
That,
I'll see if I
that's
remember it
okay.
once we get back to it. But it was a
Okay.
really good one too. It was like
Oh, darn.
it was like a physiological tactic.
Hmm. Interesting.
Anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like I come across it a lot as far as just like in the comments, not even like
Mm-hmm.
specifically like people that are like, okay, maybe this people follow like a cult or whatever, but the just like there's a lot of like, as I said before, you know, this scholar says this, or you can't believe listen to this scholar, or you're listening to these pagan texts, or like almost, I guess there's an idea of, oh, here's a fun one. So there's like I see this a lot of times as like YouTube leaders. What
Hmm.
they'll do is whenever someone critiques them, they'll say like, "That's not worth my time," or like they're just, being a rebel or sinful or whatever. Like anything that would make it so that I don't have to listen to your video or take it seriously at all. I'm just going to insult it. I've come across that a lot. Not that it's specifically like a cult thing, but I guess it's popular among cult tactics, and it's also an example of a undercutting critical thinking skill.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. If you can assign like a negative motive to someone's innocent questioning, then
Hmm.
you don't really have to engage with it because they're just out to like slander your group or the leader or to like make themselves feel better. So if you can, yeah, invalidate that motivation of that person for bringing forth that question, then it's not even reputable enough that you need to engage with it.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that definitely is, yeah, a tactic that people will use. Or like even people who um, will say, like, if they've left a group, that you shouldn't listen to them because they're bitter and they have like unforgiveness in their heart. But like, what if they actually have very valid concerns? And also, those two things don't cancel each other out. So, like, that person could still have a valid criticism or concern. But yeah, so these reflexive, like, labeling people and like assigning a negative motivation to their questioning so that you don't have to engage with it is a sign that they don't have that psychological safety, that they just have this defensive mechanism that pops up. That points to me that there's already a significant amount of psychological control that's been fostered in the way that they think about things and the way that they respond to outsiders. That's
Yeah.
definitely like a red flag. I'm not saying that you owe every person who like pops up on your thread and says something an answer, but like if you just reflexively dismiss them for any number of reasons, then yeah, that's definitely a big red flag.
Yeah, it's a really fine line because it's like, okay, so realistically, someone who's a YouTuber does not have all the time in the world to be watching other people's videos. But also, you
Mm-hmm.
should take things seriously if there are actual critiques that,
Yeah,
nobody's perfect about everything. You
totally.
know.
But often too, like leaders, especially the more stereotypical, like charismatic cult leaders, they have built such an incredible narrative and an origin story that has built into it a way to deflect criticisms and comments. So, like, a really common one is like that this leader was like unfairly treated or maligned or like was slandered and tossed aside, or that they have some kind of grievance that they were persecuted or unfairly treated. So, like, if you have that thinking, and if that's a part of that leader's origin story, that they suffered this grave injustice and were labeled this when they weren't, then they can continue to use that as a way to protect themselves from criticism. So, yeah, if a leader was unfairly treated, then they can say that the people coming at them with questions don't actually have authentic, true questions or concerns. They're just trying to bring up that old system that like caused them a grave injustice and that they were persecuted under. And the thing about these cult leaders' origin stories is that when you dig a bit deeper, often so much of it is deception and lies because that's such a core part of these groups. And having a cult leader with a really fascinating and compelling origin story, it gets people's buy-in much quicker. So like if you tell people that this person is disbelieved by the mainstream world, but it's because people are afraid to see the truth, then you can judge and assign that motive to people who have questions. So that narrative story provides convenient ways to deflect any kind of criticism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's deep. Um, hmm. Oh yeah. I don't know if this will be any different than a previous answer, but I can't help but think that maybe there's some people that are listening here that maybe they might have been in a cult, and that's why they're interested in this video,
Hmm.
and they're out of it, and like maybe they have their own life, and like they don't talk to anybody in the members, but I can't help but think that almost like once you're in that, or once you've been susceptible to that, or once you've been hardened by that, that there could be still lingering effects. I would
Hmm.
assume you agree with that, and if you do, then could you talk to about maybe, I don't know, advice or what you would do if you were in that situation?
Yeah. So the lingering after effect that we see when a lot of people leave is this really corrosive sense of shame. And what this means in like really practical ways is that people often don't speak up about the harm that they experienced in these damaging groups because they have such a radioactive sense of shame and self blame. And because they carry that, they're not going to come forward and tell their story, which means that these groups have a way of keeping these stories underground because that shame lingers and people will blame themselves and they won't understand that people are intentionally recruited and that they are conditioned and slowly brought into this way of thinking and that they were targeted. Um, and so often when we see like one person finally come forward, there's so many more. That person just represents, yeah, the experiences and harm that was suffered. And they managed to break free from that shame in a way that they want to warn other people. But yes, so many people who have these experiences will not really be public about it and won't open up about it. And they will carry just such significant shame and self blame about it. And that's why I feel like it's so important to educate on this topic to help people understand that every single one of us is vulnerable, but also that what happened to you and what you were drawn into, that your story can be such a powerful tool for change in the world and exposing harm that has been done when there's been exploitation and harm that has been perpetuated under this guise of actually helping people or doing something good, that shame isn't really all yours to carry, and it needs to be put back onto those people that have exploited people's basic desires for knowledge and hope and understanding, and that we can protect other people from being drawn into these groups. And I can't tell you how often people only recognize what happened to them when they hear someone else describe something so similar. And the light bulb goes off, and they realize that it was an orchestrated campaign of persuasion and influence and like manipulation that they were the target of. Yeah. So I have so much respect for people who are able to say that they left this group and what their experience was, and to be able to share that with other people so that people aren't drawn into these groups.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is really difficult. I appreciate the inspirational aspect of what you said there because, like, yeah, it does take a lot of, like, it is very hurtful essentially to be public about that kind of thing. Not
Yeah.
hurtful, but like a very uncomfortable feeling. And there is the potential of hurt from other people, like maybe that are still in the cult from lashing out. But at the same time, it's also very important and can be very beneficial to be public about that. So,
Yeah. And I'll just say too that telling your story is like a very powerful way to take back some of that
mm,
power from that leader, because that leader, when they recruited you, when they cultivated your genuine curiosity into something that they exploited and that they used and weaponized against you, they believed that you would take your story to the grave, that that shame would silence you and you would never breathe a word about it. They believed that that compliance that they conditioned in you would keep you quiet and you would never ever reveal what happened to you. So when you tell your story, it can be such a powerful way to take back some of that power and to push back against that shame and that control that was cultivated in that person.
You have time
Yeah.
for one more question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right. So, my friend Laura, she's another YouTuber. She says, this is one of the things I don't understand, why some people feel shame when people have done them wrong. So, could you talk about one, why some people feel shame and other people don't in this type of environment? And then two, like just the background of like how that actually occurs where people feel shame about things like that.
Yeah. So there's shame, even when people themselves haven't done anything wrong, because we have this perspective that only certain types of people are victims of these destructive groups. So there's a shame that comes with this framing that you're a stupid person, or that you are naive, or that you are just not very smart. So there's a shame that comes with that. And that's a part of the psychology of what we want to believe about the world, which we call the just world hypothesis. And it's that we believe that if we are good people and smart, that we won't be hurt to a certain extent, that we can defend ourselves against people that want to harm us and hurt us. Um, and that makes us think that we could never be like other people who have been drawn into these groups. So, even just being in a part of these groups, even if you weren't made to also target other people and bring additional people in, you will still feel shame because people believe that only stupid people get drawn into these destructive groups. Um, and that is really not the truth. So, anybody who is not a robot, who has a who is living and breathing, is vulnerable to these groups, and that's one thing we need to keep pushing back on. But yeah, that's a big part of why people feel
Yeah.
shame even when they haven't done anything themselves, is because the belief that only stupid people get drawn into these groups, but that's not true at all.
Yeah, that is really interesting of like
Mm-hmm.
there's almost like a shameful aspect in itself of like, hey, I was in a cult and I'm supposed to be the smart one, right? But I clearly
Yeah,
am not. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this situation. Um,
yeah,
my first thought was like of like maybe why some people do and some people don't. It feel shame about these types of things is because partly like I guess past experiences of like trauma and stuff like that, or like self-talk of yourself. Like some people are more likely to just like beat themselves up. Like they'll be nice to someone in that same situation, but
mm-hmm.
themselves are like, oh, I'm so stupid. I'm totally made to like you won't treat yourself the same way as you do other people.
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's like
yeah,
more people more susceptible to that like shame ideas, but
yeah.
also different experiences, of course. Like some people in cults don't have those same environments as another person in the same cult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is actually part of the reality testing that I do with clients that come to me, and they're trying to like unpack what they experienced and how they got from here to here and how they didn't see these things. There's so much confusion and they are so desperate to understand how this happened to them. And part of it is just understanding that our human psychology makes us vulnerable and that these leaders are incredibly sophisticated and have these calculated um, plans to bring people in step by step by step. So it's not that we're stupid, it's that these people are brilliant at what they do. Um, and so it's shifting that shame and starting to really like understand that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Well, you don't do you offer counseling for people that have been in cults like um worldwide? Like, can people contact you, or is that something that you
Yeah.
don't want people to do, or what?
Yeah. So I'm not a counselor. So I was formally trained as a counselor. But then when I moved, I had to switch over my licensure and I haven't done that yet. So I'm offering like coaching and consulting, but I use a lot of the tools and frameworks that I gained when I worked as a therapist. And so, really, what we do is, yeah, start to break down and untangle how people have been subjected to these campaigns of control and manipulation, and how to recover from coercive control and to recover from this thought control and this indoctrination. And this is what I was talking about, where when people leave, they need to build that self trust again. So that's like a really big part of what I do. And I see people virtually. So yeah, they can find me on my website. It's freefromcontrol.ca. They can book a consultation with me, and whether that is someone who wants to get more information because they're concerned about their sister or their partner, or whether they themselves have a situation that they really want to unpack and understand. Yeah, I work with both of those kinds of people. So yeah, they can shoot me an email or head to my website. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes just simply talking to people about that kind of stuff can be helpful, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, like an expert on the topic. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. So links will be in the description and a little bit about your background. People can also watch our past video that we did together on
Yeah.
something related to your thesis on
Mm-hmm.
complementarianism and how churches can kind of have this environment of not, I guess, cults, but coercive control. So people can check
Yeah.
out that video.
Yeah.
But otherwise, any last thoughts before we get going?
I would just say that every single person deserves to have a life that they are living free from coercion and abuse and manipulation. Like, we all deserve to have freedom of thought. That's such a basic, fundamental thing that every human being deserves to have. And so when we have come under the influence of other people, um, if that's been someone's experience, they deserve to unpack that and to heal from that and to put that shame where it actually belongs and to understand that process. So, yeah, I want people to feel hopeful after hearing all of this and to understand that, yeah, there's a way out of this and a way to heal from undue influence and these kinds of manipulation. So, yeah,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
deserve that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Amen. Yeah, preach. Yeah, so everybody go check out your Bethany's website
yeah,
and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell
yeah.
us your experiences, and otherwise, thank you, Bethany. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
You too. Thanks so much, Zach. Bye.